Hello, Confirmation students. This is session 10 on the Judges. This week we are back in the Bible, and more specifically the Old Testament. Before our diversion to cover Martin Luther and the Reformation in session 8 and justification in session 9, we had covered Genesis session 4, Exodus session 5, the law in session 6, and the Ten Commandments in session 7. As a little review, the Israelites under the leadership of Moses were saved from their slavery to the Egyptians, crossed the Red Sea, and led into the Sinai Desert. That is where their apostasy, a fancy word for sinning, became a problem. Frustrated by the leadership of Moses, the people sinned against God many times, and each time God punished them, and they recommitted themselves only to repeat that cycle over and over again. In order to form the Israelites into a unique people devoted to the one God of their ancestors, God gave the law of Moses and the Ten Commandments, and that is where we left them, committed to living godly lives devoted to God, wandering in the desert for 40 long years as their punishment for their faithlessness. How did they do? Not very well. As Israel moved from slavery to nomadic living, then to a culture of war, and then finally into kingdom-mindedness, its leadership also experienced great changes. Moses led them from the taskmaster's whip in Egypt into the desert. After the 40 long years of wandering at the leadership of Joshua, God allowed the Israelites to cross the Jordan River to take possession of the Promised Land. Though we didn't look at the book of Joshua, Joshua was the one Moses appointed to be his successor as leader of the Israelites and the one to take the people across the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. Before the entire nation of Israel crossed over, the Promised Land was divided up among the 12 tribes of Israel. Remember, they are the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel, hence the 12 tribes of Israel. There is a map on page 2102 in the back of the Lutheran Study Bible that lays out the inheritance of each tribe. Joshua's order from the Lord was to cross the river Jordan and trust God to take the land that was possessed by the Canaanites. Not trust in their own skills as an army, but to trust in the Lord to take the land possessed by the Canaanites. God told them that they were going to purge the land of its inhabitants because they were wicked people. Israel's mission was clear. They were not to be influenced by the Canaanites' wicked practices and the cultural systems that fostered and endorsed them. Given that mission, let's talk about the misguided idea that Joshua and the Israelites were motivated by the act of killing a group of people. The conquest was more about ending the Canaanites' religious and cultural practices than ending their lives. The problem wasn't the people, but their idolatry. Israel's invasion was more about the dismantling of the community of which the Canaanites were a part of than ending their lives. Well, after many, many years of Joshua's leadership, Joshua died, and the leadership of the Israelites dissolved into the patriarchal leadership of the 12 tribes of Israel. Sometimes the leadership did what the Lord told them to do, but at other times the various tribes went their own way, sometimes moving farther away from faith in God of their ancestors and closer to the gods of the Canaanites, which they were supposed to have wiped out. For about a 200-year period, the Israelites lived under the guidance of judges established by God. And that's where it gets a little confusing. Not all of the judges were excellent at leading. Some of the judges who were good at leading weren't liked by the people, which essentially stripped them of their authority. To add to this chaos, sometimes in Judges we hear multiple voices guiding at once, or at least overlapping one another with contrary advice. As if it wasn't enough, the Israelites weren't very good listeners. There was a seriously small chance of God's direction for the people finding its way through all those filters. It wouldn't get much better when the nation finally came under the rule of kings, which is the subject of session 11, which we will have next week, but at least then it was pretty clear who was in charge. Here's what you need to know. We live in a world of violence which is both quite different and quite similar to life in ancient Israel. The biggest difference is stability. The Israelites were undergoing a lot of transition, most of which was difficult and unwelcome. Their history was marked by almost constant war and violence, and that definitely had an impact on their desire to have the judges to provide protection and power and leadership. God gave the people judges, but that doesn't mean they were all good leaders. Many of them had redeeming qualities, but they were singularly focused. It made for bad leadership and even worse situations. This is a deeply ambiguous section of the Bible. There will be no point in making it easier than it really was. God gave the people of Israel what they wanted, even though it ended up not being the best for them. But God advocates for God's people then and now and forever, even when they make mistake after mistake, and that's good news for us. Listening to God and community is necessary for leadership and discernment. We will find points in this lesson where listening or not made all the difference. This can be a strong connection for us in helping us make sense of all this complicated part of the biblical narrative. Now, about the Lutheran Study Bible, the introduction to Judges is found beginning on page 402 in the Lutheran Study Bible. Please read the article entitled Background File, What's the Story, and What's the Message? These articles can be found at the beginning of every book of the Bible and are very helpful in getting the basic understanding of each book's context. Into the story. The Bible story tells the story of 12 judges. About half of them had little impact and are called minor judges. The others, whom you might label as major judges, are Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. Of those 6, only 3, really, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, are memorable. You can read about Deborah in Judges chapter 4 through chapter 5, and I entitled this section, Just a Girl. And you can read about Gideon in Judges chapter 6, a small man from a very small tribe. And you can read about Samson in Judges 13 through 16, and I call this a real superhero. There is a pattern to each of these stories that begins, the Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord punished them. And then after the Israelites called out to the Lord heard them and sent a Savior in the form of a judge. Here's the essay questions for this week. In 150 of your own words, briefly answer one of the following questions below. So I'm going to give you 2 questions about Deborah. Answer one of them with 150 words of your own. Number 1. In Judges chapter 4, verses 1 to 16, we learn that one of God's most clever judges was a woman by the name of Deborah. What did Deborah do that made her a great judge? Question number 2. These days, we're used to seeing women in leadership positions, but during the time of the judges, it was less common. In fact, out of the 12 judges mentioned, Deborah was the only woman. What made her an effective leader? Answer one of those 2 questions with 150 words. The next 2 questions, questions 3 and 4, have to do with the judge by the name of Gideon. Again, I want to use you to use 150 of your own words to explain the following questions. One of the two following questions. In Judges chapter 6, verses 36 to 40, Gideon lays out a fleece. Laying out of a fleece is not a very common expression, but it is used from time to time, and it comes from this passage. What does laying out a fleece mean? Question number 4. In Judges chapter 8, verses 22 to 35, Gideon made an ephod, a kind of liturgical garment worn by a priest. He made it out of gold. What did he do with it? What did the Israelites do with it? What happened to the Israelites as a result of what they did? And what can we learn from this? 150 words explaining question 3 or 4. The next two questions, number 5 and number 6, have to deal with the judge by the name of Samson. In Judges 15, 14 to 20, Samson gained quite a reputation as a powerful man. His story, beginning to end, is a magical and brutal at the same time. And yet, at the end of this passage, he was rewarded by judging Israel for 20 years. What do you think is going on here? Number 6. God's judges were not perfect people, but they still were called by God. They didn't have all the answers or always make the wise choices, but God still wanted the judges to use their God-given gifts to help others. In your opinion, what would have been the most important characteristic or spiritual gift to be an effective judge? So I want you to use 150 words to explain question 5 or question 6. So 6 questions. I want you to answer your choice of 1 or 2, your choice of 3 or 4, and your choice of 5 or 6. God bless you. Have a good week. Bye-bye.